Welcome to Teklehaymanot.
Thank you, Teklehaymanot. Thank you.
And you're connecting from Manchester.
Yes, I'm currently based in Manchester. Yes.
How long has it been since you moved to Manchester?
I started at the end of last year, so I totally moved at the end of December 2024, which is like about three and a half months now.
How is the getting used to process going?
Well, I mean, like in terms of like, I think living in Norway for many years, the first thing that people talk about is the weather. And I think I must say that has been an upgrade moving south to Manchester. It's even though it's not that south, it has. I mean, we feel like it's been an upgrade in terms of that, and it's been like quite an uphill in terms of like starting life here, with a lot of teaching at the beginning of the position. But I'm quite settled now. I must say.
Well, interesting that you say it's in terms of whether it's been an upgrade. I lived in Norway in Bergen for 4 months, I think, it would have been in 2019. And before I went then, I had heard a lot of people complain about weather in Norway. But my experience was actually to the contrary. I loved every bit about Bergen, except for the fact that everything was a rip-off. It's expensive, although my university was paying for my accommodation, so the hit.
I guess you came on the.
I think
I guess you came on the best time of Norway. Like no, Bergen can be
I
perfect
went
when
to
it's sunny.
Bergen 3 times actually. One where I lived for 4 months was from May to July or August.
That's a
Another
good
time
time.
was in October, and another time would have been in August. But in all every time I lived there, I don't remember ever complaining about the weather actually. So I was surprised. And I always joke that life from Norway to every other country is a downgrade, because I had the best experience in Norway. The only thing that I could have complained if I had been paying for my own accommodation would have been the fact that everything was expensive. So
Yeah, yes. But I think you've been lucky with that. I mean, in terms of price, yes, like there are very few places on the planet where price of a sandwich is more expensive than Norway. But I think you've been lucky with the weather. From my experience of Bergen and other parts of Norway, it's like either it rains or snows, or you have those 5 days of like summer in the summer. That's basically the impression of Norway after living there for about 10, 11 years. So like any change from that is an upgrade for me, except for going to hotter places. Yeah,
yeah, but also I think Trondheim and Bergen are, at least geographically, they are very far apart, and I would imagine the weather is also maybe different. Maybe Trondheim is a bit colder,
a little bit more darker
darker.
and I'm in the winter. But I think in terms of rain, I think probably like it's the same level.
Yeah, but all this to say that I don't understand people who leave Norway for the UK. Who were the writer who said that if someone is bored of life in London, then they are bored of life. That was to say that London is the cream, the top, and for me that is Norway. But you have left it, so it's too late now to make that point. But
It's a point of no return.
yeah, that's a typical Scandinavian conversation for a 10-minute meeting. 9 minutes is about the weather, and then the last minute is about the actual subject.
Well, I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean the weather is what we live in every day, and that's something I think it's important to. Well, it's not about the weather; it's about venting other issues as well. So it's a scapegoat. Like people tend to vent through the weather. Like I'm so bored today. It's raining. It's icy outside, or it's so warm outside that I need to. So it's like like a way of venting your frustration about other things as well.
well, it's for us here in Sweden. It's a very important, cherished subject, and we talk about it every day. But I think it's the same in the UK and in Norway. People like talking about
It
the
is.
weather,
It is a
but.
conversation starter.
Yeah, we're limited by time, so we can't go on about the weather. What are you getting up to in Manchester then?
Well, like I said, I used to live in Norway for 11 years or more. Like I did all my degrees except my bachelor's there. So I did my master's, my PhD, postdoc, and I got a permanent position as an associate professor at the same place. So there was a point of like feeling like I was kind of like getting stuck in a place, even though it was a place that I thrived in, even though that's a place where I sort of like built my career, academic career. There was this sense that I need to go somewhere, I need to taste something else. And that was like in 2024, I felt like I need to try something, and started looking for jobs in different places, academic, but also like non-academic. And I think it's one of the few places that I applied. Like, it takes a lot to build a CV and to send like an application, right? So the first job that I applied was to Manchester, and I was lucky. I was offered the position. I got the position as a lecturer in environment and development, which is like basically a teaching and research position. I have like a 50 teaching, 50% research position. For the last few months, like I've been, as I said, it's been like really an uphill start. With 3 weeks into the start of my position, I had like the start of the teaching term, which was quite intense. I had 2 undergraduate courses that I had to complete, and which I'm about to be done with the teaching. And I also have like research, sort of like follow up of the research that I have been and writing that I've been doing in the past, which I still continue to finish up and to sort of like continue. Yeah, that's what I'm up to.
Is the research sort of a continuation of what you were doing at NTNU, or is it slightly different?
Well, my research at NTNU has been taking all kind of directions. So I started my doctoral degree in 2016, and that research position was with a focus on Kenya and Tanzania, environmental conservation policies in Kenya and Tanzania. So I looked into the environmental politics of those countries, sort of like doing all kind of analysis about land rights and sort of like related policies in both countries in connection with environmental conservation, which like my doctoral degree was about 4 years, so it ended in 2020, after which I was offered another position, which was a research on another context in Norway. And then, as you know, like in 2020, which is around the end of the PhD period, we had this terrible start of the war in Tigray, which sort of like, I wouldn't say completely, but largely shifted the focus of my research. So for the last 4.5 years, I've been following and sort of like writing and providing short analytical pieces on Tigray itself, on the crisis, in terms of like environmental impact of the war, in terms of like humanitarian and human rights impact of the war, in terms of justice, in terms of all that kind of issues associated with the war. So when I say I'm continuing the research, it's basically following up on what I've been, like the data that I've been collecting over the last 4 years, analyzing them and making them sort of like presenting in different public conferences, but also publishing both in academic and non-academic outlets. So that's sort of like, it's in a way a continuation of what I've been doing at NTNU for the last few years.
Environmental politics is one of these terms that you feel you know it, but I sense that there is more to it than meets the eye. So maybe tell me about it. What is environmental politics?
So I have had this, so that, as I told you, my PhD project was on Kenya and Tanzania. And when I was offered the position to do that PhD piece in the project, which was part of a larger EU-funded project. I think it was about 10 million euro project. And I was one of the few social scientists looking into the policies, like the government policies. The rest of the team, which was about like 100 and more than that, researchers, professors, and other kind of researchers, were looking into conservation, like the conservation of species, like mammals and all kind of biodiversity species in the East Africa, like in the savanna grasslands of South East Africa. My project, which was part of that bigger project, was looking into what states, what kind of policies states put in place to effect conservation. So the conservation, environmental politics is in this case is about what the kind of policies, the kind of measures that states and related actors devised to control the relationship between people and their environment. So the relationship between, for example, in Tanzania and Kenya, it would be the relationship between the pastoral farming communities around the national parks. So in that case, for example, I looked into how Kenya, which is, these two countries are very different. So you have Kenya, which is a neoliberal, almost absent state where the market actors play the main role of making this relationship exist. So the relationship between people and their environment is pretty much shaped by the market. Whereas in Tanzania, which is a post-socialist state, or still a socialist state, which has almost total control over everything that goes on the land. So land is, for example, owned by the state. So the land users, the locals, are sort of like, they have the user rights. They don't have the tenancy right. They don't have the ownership of the land. So they are basically tenants over the land. So this is sort of like the environmental politics at a local scale, at a national local scale. But when we talk about environmental politics, you might have heard about these global environmental agendas that, like, for example, in 2022, there was this COP15, which is the equivalent of the COP in the climate change debate. The equivalent of it in the biodiversity species conservation is the COP15, COP16. I think COP16 is coming up. In the COP15, our leaders, global leaders, gathered in Montreal, in Canada, to decide how much land space that should be left for conservation, for protecting species. So those kind of like global agendas, and then how they cascade, how they get translated into local policies is what we consider environmental politics, environmental. So it's about how policies shape the relationship between people and their environment.
Fascinating subject, and I think this is maybe time for digression into the Tigray war as well, and your contribution to that, because you have written a lot of journal articles and opinion pieces and all that, and I think people familiar with Tigray will know you as an important contributor. So of course, most of us were just shouting about what was happening in Tigray, but we didn't have any sort of proper lens through which to see the war. But for you, it was through the politics of environmental politics that you saw everything. So maybe tell me a little bit about that. What did it mean for you? How did you see the Tigray war unfold from that point of view?
So thanks for that. Obviously, we were all rushing, like trying to sort of like, it was a firefight. So we were all like concerned about our families, concerned about the impact of the war on people. Like so the first thing that comes to mind is like children starving, older people being displaced and getting killed. So that's basically what is war often associated with. But for someone that studies politics, studies like the underlying frameworks of like relationship between people, state, and the environment, it's necessary to look into what the long-term impacts of whatever is happening, whether it's war or flooding or other crises. So, and I think it's sort of like engraved in me from like childhood, like growing up in Tigray. I think we will probably go back to that, but growing up in Tigray in the 90s, 80s, you had this sense of like revival of like the environment, restoration of the environment that was going on in Tigray, like farmers gathering and building trenches, building sort of like all kind of structures to maintain the environment, which they perceived was affected by historical long instabilities, political instabilities and war. And they have that sense that the famines and the crises, the humanitarian crisis that affected Tigray for decades, being associated with environmental degradation of the region. And I think for even my master's thesis, which was a master's of philosophy in development studies in Norway, my master's thesis was basically about this. Like I wrote, so we had this training in different kind of like development courses, environment related courses, and I was like, every time I study about the environment and development, what comes to mind, the first thing that comes to mind is what we used to do as kids, going to the hills to build all the check dams and all that kind of stuff to restore the environment. And I went to Tigray to to my parents to study the village and the kind of restoration efforts that were put in place and what was missing, what was successful, what could be done better. And that kind of like I looked into the micro level process, like policy and practice in that part of Tigray, and that was for my master's thesis. So when the war came, it was just basically reversing all the things that I thought were going in the right direction. I know how fragile the place is. I know how fragile the ecosystem in Tigray is, given that it's a mountainous, given that it's a historically overutilized landscape, historically deliberately degraded landscape, and being exposed to that kind of crisis means it's easy to be reversed to what it used to be in the 80s and 70s. And that was basically what sort of like brought me back to using the environmental lens as a way of analyzing what was happening. And I think I didn't mention that earlier, but environmental politics is also about this, like how states and powerful actors kind of like marginalize certain sections of society using environmental means, or how they use the degradation or restoration of the environment as a way of marginalizing people. And if you look into the history of the Ethiopian state, you have, like I've written about this in different pieces, but very short sections because they don't allow that long kind of elaboration. But I will come back to that at some point. The Ethiopian state is built around, the current state since the 90s is built around the tension between the center and the periphery. The periphery being anything outside the center being Addis and the elite areas of Ethiopia, largely associated with like Gondar and Addis and all that kind of stuff. But the peripheries are made periphery by the center. And the peripheralization of the peripheries includes the destruction of everything, including the environment. So it's about making the regions and the peripheries subservient to the center. And making them subservient involves causing all kind of damage to their environment, to their ecosystem, to the system that they rely upon. So if I know you understand Amharic, but if you listen to the rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric that Ethiopian elites provide, it's often how Tigray is a stony mountain like that has no use. How the Tigrayans, if they decide to secede, they will starve to death because there's nothing in that. And that, as an ordinary person, when you hear that, it's just you get demoralized. You feel that Tigray is resourceless, but it has been made resourceless. It has been made unviable to sustain itself. And I could see that connection when the war started, and where the kind of rhetoric that was being fed into the propaganda mission. You could see that this was what was in the making. I think I was kind of placed both theoretically but also from practical experience to do that kind of analysis to sort of follow up the environmental connection to the crisis.
The tug of war between the center and the periphery, Teklehaymanot, is something that I hadn't really understood actually until very recently. I think it would have been 2 years ago when I was reading this book titled "The Emperor." It was a book by
This Polish guy.
It was a Polish journalist who was in Addis Ababa around the time Haile Selassie was deposed and there came to power. And he wrote it's sort of an account of interviews that he did with Haile Selassie and Derg officials. And there is this powerful passage where he's describing an interview he had with a high-ranking Ethiopian official. And the Ethiopian official is telling him the philosophical explanation behind making the peripheries. Until that point, I thought that it was a coincidence that Tigray was poor. I didn't know that there was a deliberate policy, and or to the extent that I thought there was a deliberate policy, I thought it was a case of people being cruel and wanting to punish the Tigrayans for their political views and for their ethnicity and all that. But actually, there is a deep philosophical sort of justification for why they think that hunger and famine and deliberately engineering these things is in the best interest of the center. So it's actually it's a powerful thing.
Forget Tigray.
Yeah.
Forget Tigray, which is a rebellious. Generally rebellious because of its history, because of its deep history of statehood and history of like struggle for remaining autonomous. Forget Tigray, which is like really sort of like in opposition to the central system of the country. Even what is there? Like there is no room for a second city in the country. There is no room for a city that can rival Addis in the country. And that's not the case in, I don't know, like let's go to China, for example. There's no Chinese sort of policy that prevents Shanghai from being like bigger than Beijing, for example. Whereas in the Ethiopian case, there is no room for a second city, and that's deliberate. If you, for example, listen to Abiy's speech from like 2020, 2021, 2022, you have those kind of like that kind of language where he used how Tigray was sort of like a parallel force that was emerging, and how he has turned it into nothing, a bashasha, basically. And that is basically in the philosophy of the state, the Ethiopian state, that there cannot be a second or a third powerful center outside Addis. That's basically what the formation. And this translates into all kind of and all forms of intervention that make the places less competitive compared to Addis. So you have the environment is one of them. So places get neglected in all kind of ways. So you don't get investment, you don't get the restoration efforts, for example. If there are, they will get always left like invested. And then you have deliberate destructions of like environmental resources. You have, when it comes to economy, you cannot have an industrial base as bigger than Addis anywhere else. So it has to be around the center. It has to be on the reach of the emperor, the person that's in Arat Kilo. And that was the case for like the last 150 years. Basically, you cannot have a center that is not the center. And that's also, you could also see in cultural terms, like for example, you cannot have Adwa there, like in the mountains of Adwa. It has to be in Addis. It has to be on the door of the empire. Aksum cannot be in Aksum. It has to be displaced to Addis. The capital has to have everything. So that's sort of like those appropriations, that deliberate destructions of heritage, cultural practices are part of that process of like centralizing everything. And people don't necessarily see that. Like they don't see, I mean, a lot of people see that, but there is not so many people framing it in that way, in terms of writing, in terms of like daily conversations. And I think that is sort of like what sort of like drives me as well. Like we need to sort of like see, we need to frame it, we need to show what the connections between all these dots that make sense.
I don't think this is something that people really understand in its proper essence, because I don't know if this falls within the purview of environmental politics, but one of the things that I don't understand, or I have never understood despite my best efforts, about Ethiopia and Tigray is when the TPLF came to power in 1991, it would have been. Because the fight, the 17 years fight against the Derg was, in some sense, it was a fight between the periphery and the center. That was its essence, right? But when they took the levers of power in 1991, why is it that they didn't try to restructure the power relationship between the center and the periphery? This is something that I have never understood. Is it that they didn't understand, or is there any other explanation to that?
Well, I am like in this regard, I'm like an odd. What can you say? I'm gonna give you like an amateur explanation for this. I have written a little bit about this as well. Like I think in one of them is I have this article that was published on Logic, which is on the genocidal technologies, medicine, the deprivation of medicine. And I have like a sort of like I did a retrace of like the history, like why we are where we are today, and part of that has like sort of like an explanation of why the TPLF and the coalition sort of like relapsed to the past. And I think you have this mystery, the mysticism of Ethiopia, like Ethiopia as this invincible, as something that doesn't collapse, that would never get disbanded. Is like something that has really a grip on society in Ethiopia. And I think was it Haggai Enric, this Israeli guy?
I interviewed
He
him.
has sort of like written about it a little bit now, like trying to explain why people keep going back to Ethiopia, even when they know that Ethiopia is going to come back for them again. But the most epic of that is the TPLF's failure in the 1990s to sort of like maintain the kind of like the ideology for the ideology that they used to mobilize the population for the struggle, which is to maintain autonomy, Tigrayan self-rule. But I think that the 1995 constitution and the debates during the transition period was sort of like a way of like demystifying the mysterious Ethiopia that doesn't fail, that the mysterious Ethiopia that cannot survive without being centralized. The constitution was a way of showing that there is another version of Ethiopia that could be acceptable for the rest of the population. And the constitution was, if it was to be followed in practice, I think it was a way of like sort of like enabling that, like enabling the other version of Ethiopia, which is people live within this under the umbrella of Ethiopia as long as they are treated, as long as they feel they are treated well. And I think the TPLF had the TPLF and the political guys at that time had this belief that this new structure that they have introduced to this constitution will hold, that it will, first of all, it will be accepted within Ethiopia itself, that people from the people that glorify the past will accept this. It would have a wider acceptance in the public. And they also believe that the international system would accept something like this, and that whenever this fails, a mechanism would be in place to sort of like maintain it, which was, both of these were total failure. First of all, there was large-scale acceptance of the new structure in broader, particularly marginalized Ethiopia, but there was also like a mounting sort of like opposition to it, and sort of like to the extent that it has been relegated as an ethnic federalism. It wasn't necessarily ethnic. It doesn't state anywhere in the constitution. It doesn't state that it is an ethnic federation, but the debate has sort of like shifted from regional self-rule autonomy to ethnic. So the discourse has ended up being ethnic. And which means like it's, so you get like people, I mean, it has been denigrated. It has been like to the extent that the constitution is now seen as something that should be discarded. And from the international point of view, there was no acceptance of this. First of all, there is no mechanism in the international system that recognize ethnic or this kind of federation, and that sort of like that has a mechanism to intervene whenever there is a relapse. So when people like Abiy come to power, there's no mechanism to hold them to account, to hold them, to keep them, to pressure them into maintaining the system that was put in place. So these are two of the main failures. But also, I think even in practice, since 1995, the TPLF and the EPRDF government haven't followed what was promised in the constitution. So almost total autonomy of regional states should have been practiced. There should have been more infrastructures between the regions than via Addis. There should have been more sort of like federal in nature, like federation-based infrastructure, like telecom. The telecom service shouldn't have been governed by Addis. Like there should have been possibilities for the regions to have self-ruling, sort of like maintain kind of systems. There should have been like more distributed, decentralized power system, for example. But now we are all connected to Addis. So whenever the government in Addis is angry, they can just switch off there should have been other kind of mechanisms that should have been introduced to make regions self-sustaining, which is like a full exercise of self-rule, which didn't happen. And part of why it didn't happen is because the TPLF and the coalition that it connected itself with sort of like relapsed, and they got subsumed to the traditional Ethiopian rule, which is centralized. And of course, which means they also did the same things that the previous governments did to anyone that opposed the center. So you had in Somalia, you had all kind of abuses against civilians that the PRDF government had been doing, which was also sort of like the same kind of things that have been happening in Haile Selassie during the Derg, and which became back to us, to haunt us now at a scale that hasn't been seen before. So this is like sort of like the cocktail of failures that led to the situation that we are in.
Well, so that is the sort of the theoretical and structural explanation for why the redistribution of power and the redistribution of everything didn't happen. But I think, and maybe you know more about this, but I have this distinct impression that people like Meles didn't quite have a full appreciation of the magnitude of the problem. Of course, the magnitude of the problem and its effect, we can clearly see it now. It's very blatant. And the reason why life in Tigray is unsustainable now is because nothing happens without the blessing of Addis Ababa, which is also why people have this natural tendency, people in Tigray, to give in and capitulate to Addis Ababa, because everybody knows that nothing could be done in Tigray if Addis Ababa doesn't green light it. And people listening to this might think that this is too sort of unhinged tribalists complaining about Ethiopia, but it's not. But I don't think it's even good for Addis Ababa itself, because it's such a big black hole that it sucks in everything to itself, and it creates all sorts of problems for Addis Ababa as well, which was why, by the way, the Oromo protesters happened, which is why housing is, supremely expensive now in Addis Ababa, and a lot of other problems. So this is a problem that doesn't sort of benefit anyone, as far as I could see. And I don't understand why people don't see that clearly.
Yeah, I mean, like anyone that has lived in the 80s in Ethiopia should recognize that when the rest of the country fails, when the farms in Gojam, in Tigray, in Oromia fail, the country will fail. They should recognize the fact that Addis is not an island, that it is connected to the rest of the country. I mean, like, connected in all kind of ways, but like even the food comes from the rest of the country. So what is happening today, since the last 5-6 years, is Addis it feels like it's an island. If you have, I've written about this as well, like if you have foreign friends that go to Addis and then they don't know anything about what happened in Tigray or in what's happening in Amhara and Oromia and other places, if they go to Addis today and then just come back, they would say that this country is like glorious, it's immensely progressing and all that, but they don't know the scale of what's happening elsewhere in the country. And that has kind of gave the sense of security for people in Addis as well, like this false sense of that they are like in a bubble, that they will be fine in there. But it's a bubble. It will burst, and when it bursts when your family connection to the rest of the country is broken because your family has disappeared, or it bursts when the economy collapses. The economy is based on resources from the rest of the country. And the long-term effect of this is that the country is going downwards, and this cannot isolate itself from that, insulate itself from that crisis. But for now, they don't see it. And a lot of academics that I used to collaborate with, a lot of academics that I know should understand this, don't see it. They see as if we are progressing in the right direction. But I think for I think Meles and others in the 90s, I think they knew the trouble with the country, with the structure of the country, which is why they also pushed for new sort of like governance structure. But I think when you stay in that kind of space for a long time, when you have all kind of pressure from the elite circles within the cities, within the sort of like the intelligentsia, as you would say, it's easy to get subsumed into that. It's easy to not see the broader crisis, the broader circumstances that you are governing a country under. And I think that's, I don't want to blame Meles for that, but I think that's one of the things that sort of like led to where we are today. They couldn't see what was brewing in the rest of the country, like the absence of what was promised, and then if you want to look into the relapse of Meles and others into the pro-Ethiopia, pro-centralized Ethiopia, you could also see like into the narratives that were being put out in early 2000s, like in the Ethiopian calendar, early 2000s, late 90s, about this renaissance, Ethiopia ለዘላለም ትኑር, and all that kind of rhetoric that was being put out to just show that the country is invincible, that country cannot collapse, and that's just wrong, basically wrong.
So if some or a political party that was brave enough and that had the awareness that this imbalance creates wanted to level the playing field in Ethiopia, how should and would they go about it?
I mean, like, so as it stands today, it's impossible to envision that. So, I mean, there is not even unified units, like political units from the regions that represent the interests of regions. So one thing would be to sort of like create a discussion, a broader discussion, not this reconciliation and what is this Justice and Reconciliation Commission kind of thing, but a broader discussion, inviting all kind of voices, including myself and others, and sort of like sitting and discussing a way out of this. And the way out of this is to recognize the problems with the current system. Recognizing it includes, you cannot have a country with a city of like less than 10 million people managing and owning the capital of the country. Like I think it's like 70% of the country's capital investment is in Addis. And that's a city of like 5 million, or I don't know, like 10 million, let's say. And this is a country of more than 100 million people. That cannot be justified by anyone. Like if I was to be a government, which I would never be, it is to sort of like dismantle this, to sort of like make sure that we have regions that are able to attract investment, able to maintain their own. For example, a region shouldn't like be cut off from the world because it disagrees with the central government. A region or a certain place shouldn't be disconnected from the power grid because the government isn't happy about it. So you have to recognize that problem, the problem that the center shouldn't manage everything. It should let go the power over a lot of resources. And that is what was attempted in the 1995 Constitution. It may have a lot of shortcomings, but it is something that should be sort of like, we have to go back to that kind of like discussion as well, okay?
So it's a fascinating explanation and exposition into the topic, and I didn't quite have this kind of understanding. So thank you for the explanation. I think our listeners are going to love that. But at the beginning, you said that you're doing teaching and research, and to close the circle in terms of your research, what are the problems that you're trying to understand now in terms of environmental politics, maybe in relation to Ethiopia and Tigray and the Horn of Africa?
Well, I still maintain like I keep writing pieces on Tanzania and Kenya, which is like in connection to what I used to do before. But when it comes to Ethiopia, I think I'm still like in the firefight state. I've been trying to sort of like pull myself back and to sort of like strategize and to write longer, more analytical papers. At the moment, I don't know if you have seen, but like last month there was a publication on the invisibilization of Tigray in the crisis in Tigray is the biggest humanitarian, I mean the worst human rights crisis in the last 30 years, apparently, where close to 1 million people have perished. But it's one of the least covered, and I say that because I work in a global development institute here, and I think very few people here know about what happened there. And I've been to different conferences where I would mention like I'm from Tigray, and then I would say, do you know anything about Tigray? And like basically 1 or 2 people of like hundreds of people. And that's the case. Like if you search for like the worst crisis of the last 20 years, you don't see Tigray on that kind of list, for example. So, and that sort of like triggered me, like how did we end up here? How did the crisis of this scale disappear from the public imagination, public knowledge? And to do that, you sort of like have to, you either relapse into this, well, it's the Tigrayans, it's black people, it's a minority society that has its own trouble, it's a tribal kind of, that races kind of can be something, but I don't think that's a very productive way of framing it. So I had to look into what more could explain to the silence and the invisibility of Tigray, which led me to looking into all the tactics, the different tactics that were put in place by the Ethiopian government and its allies to make the Tigray war invisible. And that, I think, is a very good contribution because it's a unique kind of contribution. So to say that this is a small tribe, so nobody cares, it's just it's not productive, kind of scholarly speaking.
And maybe it's maybe also maybe lazy, right? Yeah, it doesn't
I
explain
could
the
say
whole.
that like about anything basically.
Yeah.
I could say that about me being invisible. It's just it's very easy to it's a layman contribution, but to make it more productive and useful in a way like that, something like this could be prevented, like in a way that leads to prevention of this kind of crisis, is to dig into what happened. So I looked into what I considered what created the essence of the invisibility, so the context of the invisibility. So you have the tactics that were used to make it invisible. So you have the blockade of borders, the blockade of communication, the blockade of movement of people from to and from Tigray that prevented people from knowing what was happening. The blockade of communication and access to media is part of the essence, the context of the invisibility. I also look into the epistemic invisibility. So now we have, for example, an example of that is you have Gaza. We know that children are being killed every day. You know that civilians are being murdered every day. But you see that on video, you see that all kind of like, I mean, when I say you, it's not about you, but broader people see that, but they like, it's Hamas. It's people that sort of like deserve it, which is horrible to think. But so governments create that kind of justification for causing harm. So even if you have a lot of evidence on the media, on all kind of platforms, people don't see it, don't see the pain and suffering. And for Tigray, on top of the geographical and the context of invisibility being blocked and all, the epistemic invisibility was also put in place. The Tigrayans were often presented as this rebellious, unruly, savage, cancerous, whatever kind of framing that they were given. The Tigrayans were presented as anti-waste, often like a communist, that kind of like framing, which allowed anyone from outside to say like, these troublemakers, can you stop causing trouble if you want to get humanitarian assistance? Can you stop doing this and that to sort of like allow humanitarian assistance? So that kind of framing enabled the invisibility, even though we know the scale of what was happening. We know that 500,000, 600,000 people were killed. People don't give it that much weight because these are like rebels. These are children and families of rebels. So it doesn't make it that horrifying. And also like you have people don't. I think one of the things that the people don't see about the mass arrest of Tigrayans in the rest of the country during the war is it has many purposes, but one of them was obviously like in previous fascistic genocidal regimes, putting people in concentration camps and leading them to silent days is one. It's about getting rid of people. Happened. A lot of Tigrayans perished in the deserts in Afar and other places. But that wasn't the main purpose of the arrest and rounding up of Tigrayans from the daily life in Addis and the rest of the country. It was also about getting rid of them from the public imagination, from the public discourse about the war in Tigray. So if you have a Tigrayan neighbor, or a Tigrayan colleague, or someone that you meet in a cafe or something, and they tell you what they were going through and what their families were going through in Tigray, you would have that human connection, you know. You would sympathize with them. You would understand, even if you don't understand the scale of the crisis, you would sort of like have that connection. But by getting rid of them from the public life, that was one of the things that they did. If you went to Addis in 2021, at the height of the crisis, you wouldn't notice that there was a war in Tigray. Like if you're a foreigner. And that was largely because there was no Tigrayans talking about it. And Ethiopians were not talking about it either because there wasn't that much conversation. I'm not saying that there wasn't public support to the war, but that was one of the outcomes of the rounding up of Tigrayans. So I sort of like look into this kind of intricacies of how it became invisible. And that's one of the things I've done for the last few months. And I have few other works that are coming up. Currently I'm writing about the use of ceasefire as violence, which is, well, we talk about the ceasefire, but like I think one of the things about the ceasefire is that like, it's seemed to have sorted out the crisis in Tigray, and that's because of the lack of understanding of what ceasefire entails. So ceasefires are seizing; it's about seizing fire. So which is supposed to lead. Often it has to lead to sort of some kind of negotiated settlement of what led to the crisis in the first place. And in the case of Tigray, the Pretoria Agreement hasn't led to any negotiated settlement. Instead, it has led to all kind of violence, both in Tigray, but also in the other parts of the country. So, the moment the Pretoria Agreement was signed, you have factionalization of the alliance on the Ethiopian side. So the Eritreans, the Amharas, the other groups that fought along the Ethiopian army are not there anymore. They are fighting. But also now in Tigray, we see it has led to sort of like a prison fight, which is the Tigrayans are fighting among themselves. And this isn't an unpredicted outcome of the ceasefire. It was meant to lead to that situation. And the Ethiopian government and its officials have been, I mean, if anyone wanted to follow what they were doing, you could see that they were basically pushing for that kind of situation to emerge. And now we have interfactional conflict within Tigray itself, and we have very uncertain kind of future that's coming. So I'm sort of like trying to look into that kind of emerging development following the ceasefire agreement. And I have some other works that are going on this, on the crisis, on the Tigray crisis. I don't know. Maybe I'm boring you.
No. I think the last point you mentioned is what other people have described as war by other means, right? The Ethiopian regime has used the ceasefire to continue its war on Tigray, and without any pressure, because the impression that I think is sort of deliberate. The international community has it that things are going the right way and the Ethiopian regime is doing the right things. So the sanctions that have been imposed on the regime are being lifted and rapprochement is being pursued and all that. But, all of us know that nothing has changed. The AU would say that the guns have been silenced, but that's pretty much it. People in IDP in Tigray are still in IDP and are actually in a worse of condition because the aid that they used to get from US aid and other humanitarian providers has been suspended because of politics in the US and other places. And the Tigrayan territories occupied during the war remain occupied. And the political negotiation that was supposed to have started between the TPLF and the Ethiopian regime, according to the agreement, has not started. And none of the other provisions of the agreement have materialized. So in all sorts of meaningful senses, except for the guns that were, blazing every day, the war remains. But the other point you mentioned, the invisibilization, that was a tongue twister. That is something that shocks me and angers me every day, because if you went around, for instance, Manchester, and asked people what was the deadliest war, for instance, in the past, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, I would bet anything, not that I have much, but I would bet anything that out of 10 people, 0 would say Tigray. Nobody knows about it. And of course, one sort of explanation is to say that, this is a tiny land in Africa, who cares, and nobody hears about it. But surely there must be more, because, more than 500,000 people killed and entire ecosystems destroyed. And in literally every other place, surely people would have known about it. But in the case of Tigray, the reality is that nobody knows. And you seem to be saying that the regime has done a good job in terms of hiding the atrocities and all the criminalities that unfolded in Tigray. But that leads me to another point that I wanted to ask you, Teklehaymanot,
I think I'm going to correct you on that before. I'm not correcting you, just adding on what you were saying. So I think I said you have the context of invisibilization, which is mainly done by the Ethiopian government, but then you have the context of the epistemic, the framing of the war. So the framing of the war as a rebel, a counter-insurgency war, which is not, it's a genocidal campaign. But to frame it as a counter-insurgency war has enabled the UK government to not say anything about it. So it's a counter-insurgency. You can do whatever you want. But you also have this sort of international side of it. So I think I write in the paper itself how the UN system and the diplomatic system in Addis sort of accepted this framing of the war. The UN, particularly the UN agencies in Addis, were like propagating, like sort of like projecting this kind of framing to the international community, which I think also helped the Ethiopian government in that kind of propaganda struggle. And that is because I think part of that is how Abiy from the government in the beginning, when he came to power, the first few months were about assigning different ministers, appointing different ministers to get in the government, in the cabinet. Some of the people that he put in place are influential people who had pretty recognizable roles in the international system. So that includes, for example, the president, the lady Sahle-Work, yes, who used to be, she's a very well-recognized diplomat, and she's known in the UN system. You have the commissioner of the Human Rights Commission, who used to be at the Human Rights Watch in Africa, and he's known for
and Amnesty. I think he was also a staffer.
He was, yeah. And and then you have the Chief of Justice, who was also one of the propagandists in the framing the war against Tigray as a counter-insurgency. You have all these people that were influential outside, like in the broader global community, being a member of his ministerial cabinet, which means, I mean, who are you to sort of like question this government's actions when you know that Daniel is the commissioner of the commission? Who are you to question the government when the president is a well-known, very kind-looking person that works in international diplomatic circles? So that also allowed him to do what he did and conciliate, basically. Yeah, so that's what I want to just point
it's
out.
an important correction, but that was one of the sort of powerful tricks that Abiy pulled on the international community, right? He gave important positions to people who have positive image in the international community, deserved, undeserved, actually, as it turns out. But I was going to say, so I mean, of course, everything you said is right, and you know that it's about geopolitics in some sense, right? And the international system does tend to tolerate things if they are being perpetrated by an ally, and Abiy was seen as an ally. But you know that there was a similar case in the case of Israel, for instance. In the beginning, there was an attempt to hide what was happening in Gaza and to defend Israel. But there came a moment when the whole thing became too much, and you could literally see the international community and everybody move to the right side of history and to start condemning what was happening and to say the right things, right? But that never happened in the case of Tigray. And I'm not trying to minimize what has happened in Gaza, but so far it's only 60,000 or I think 70,000 people who have been killed, right? Compared to more than 500,000 in the case of Tigray. So ordinarily, you would have expected the international community to react in a certain way at some sort of threshold point. But that never materialized. And I think part of the reason is maybe what you're saying, the invisibilization has worked. And I was going to ask you, before you corrected me, Teklehaymanot, whether part of the reason why the Tigray thing has been invisible is because there hasn't been that many Tigrayans who have been doing what you have been doing, which is writing about it in a way that is acceptable to different bodies in the international community, publishing it in journals, appearing on the right media. But I'm going to focus on in the writing because that's what you have been doing. What are the lessons that you have learned in terms of that, in terms of the writing? What is holding people back from doing what you have been doing?
Yes, I mean that's a really good point. I think and I think this. Thank you for bringing that up. And I don't think I mean I have written few works, and I have been really trying to invest on that, sort of like being intentional and deliberate in what I write, and I think that's quite important in this kind of situation. And I think I mean compare it to we don't want to compare with places, but compare it to Ukraine, for example, where you have it's now 3 years since the start of the war, and you have books, you have articles, you have all kind of coverage. I have even been interviewed by Ukrainian outlet that basically documents the crisis in Ukraine, but they also sort of cover other crises that they think are relevant and similar to their situation. And to the extent of work that people have put in place in Ukraine is incredible. But of course, that doesn't mean that we are on a sort of like equal footing in terms of like what kind of resources that we have, what kind of training that people have had prior to the crisis. Ukrainians are more well placed in the academic circles in all kind of places in Europe, in the West, compared to Tigrayans. But I think for Tigrayans, I think that we have done an incredible job of like communicating what was going on in Tigray in terms of like protesting on the streets, making the situation known in the streets to an extent. But I don't know how effective that is. But it has to. I know that it has an effect. But I think what was missing in the Tigrayan campaign, which is why I also sort of like tended to sort of like lay back and to sort of sit and write, is the writing part. Like, I mean, there is barely like books about this crisis. There is barely any meaningful, analytically stronger pieces communicating what we experienced. And partly it's because of the crisis the depths of the crisis, and that we are not used to doing that. And partly because we were under sort of like full communication blackout. Even though a lot of us were outside, it was almost impossible to gain access to material from the ground. So that sort of like prevented us from making sense of the crisis and communicating it. But I think that shouldn't have been the case. I mean, there was already enough material to write and to communicate. And I think, and I was also myself like really reluctant to write and to sort of like publish in a journal on Tigray when I myself was a junior academic that have not written nothing about anything like this before. Like my writings was about like policies, and the impacts of my work would be more long-term, more like influencing policies in countries, not immediate like sort of like firefighting kind of pieces. So for a while I was reluctant to write anything that has to do with an academic and like an analytical kind of writing. It took a lot of sort of like courage to do that. And that was also partly because in the beginning I thought there were like senior academics, Tigrayans, and academics that worked on Tigray, like foreign researchers that have had historical research connection with Tigray, that would be writing about this. But when that wasn't the case, so I sort of had to pick the shovel and to do the job myself. And in that regard, I think the struggle for a junior academic like myself is you have a career that you have to build, and then you have this situation where you have to write pieces that don't necessarily have to do anything with your career. Like the articles I write for Tigray probably don't adapt anything to my career development. But I think they are some of the most treasured pieces that I have written, like the pieces that I feel target a certain aspect of the war that people should know about, that people should frame their thoughts around. That has been like so the struggle between balancing your academic career, whatever career you have, and writing for this kind of situation has been a challenge. But as academics, especially as like if you're early career academic who is looking for a certain progress in a certain direction, this is also an opportunity for you to show that you can actually analyze a complicated crisis and make it legible to people, legible both to Tigrayans, to the domestic audience, to ourselves, to Tigrayans, but also to the outside audience. How would I don't know, like a Norwegian colleague of mine understand the Tigray crisis if I don't do it? So for us, we have you have the emotional drive to do it. You have the analytical skills that you have learned for your doctoral degree or for whatever degree you are doing. You have the material access to it, like the primary material, the stories that you hear from your mom, from your relatives that have had first-hand experience of the war itself. So a combination of that is like unique works that could have like an outcome that's very influential on a reader. And I think that's also some of the feedback that I get from readers about, like, for example, the recent article on invisibilization is that I'm not the most eloquent writer, but I think it's an academic article which has emotional power as well. Like I'm speaking about myself, but it's also with an academic sort of like conceptual framing. So for us, I think we need to do that. We need to analyze. We need to make it legible. We need to tell our own story. Like it's about 10 pages of what your family went through or what you're going through. So you should be able to do that. We should be able to document. It doesn't have to be in journal publications, but it could be like in any kind of outlet. It could be in documentation for your own consumption at home to document what you experienced, what you have gone through. And I think that's sort of like something that I would also suggest that a lot of people do. And I know that there's a lot of people that have degrees that are able to write for other contexts, but not for Tigray. So we should be encouraged to do that. And yeah, there's not many better examples of myself for a person who wouldn't have had the courage, but sort of had to do that for that purpose.
Well, I mean, you say that you're not the most eloquent writer, but I think you're a capable and prolific writer, and you have done a wonderful job in terms of, chronicling what has been happening in Tigray from the point of view of environmental politics. And I think thanks to you, there wouldn't be any shortage of material in that regard. But I think more broadly, I think there's a lack of awareness in the sort of Tigrayan circles about the importance of the written material. But the written material is a very, very powerful thing. Just to give one example, the New Lines Institute, probably the only sort of reputable body that has concluded that genocide might have been committed in Tigray. If you look at the sort of bibliography, so all the material is written material. It's not tweet, it's not YouTube. And all sort of even the articles that we have published on Tigray, most of them have been cited. And the articles that you have written. And that tells you the power of the written material. So that would be actually my message to the people who are in a position to be able to write. That is something that they should sort of take up and do. But I think maybe one issue you raise is that many people don't know how to find a delicate balance between their own academic, not just academic, but professional development and writing about Tigray. And sometimes the two might contradict, writing about Tigray because it's politics at the end of the day, and you might not be in a position to go into political matters and still maintain your professional progression. So what I do understand it's a problem for a lot of people. But I think that the written material is very, very powerful. And in this regard, you have been an excellent example. Just one.
I think it's also, I think it's in a way it's therapeutic as well. Like, I think it was the first 6 months of the war, I had submitted my doctoral degree and I was waiting for my defense. So I was basically tweeting almost 20 hours a day, tweeting and communicating with people, trying to get the message out, trying to tell that I couldn't reach my parents, basically. So I somehow powered through that period, basically doing what everyone was doing at the time. But when I had my defense in March 2021, after that defense, a lot of things became real for me. Like I started my next job a week later, and when I started my new postdoc position, during it's called like a startup seminar, like the seminar where you give like a speech about what your next project is going to be. I told my colleagues that I was going through this kind of crisis, that I haven't talked to my parents for 6 months. And they were like really shocked. And the head of the department, he said, you need to talk to actually a professional, a psychologist about this. And my institute has a collaboration. We have like a free service for staff members. And I hadn't even thought about like the immensity of the crisis I was in. And I said, yes, I could do that. And then I went to the psychologist. Not that I had hallucinations or anything, but that I was under immense pressure of that situation. And I went to the psychologist and we had few sessions. Every session I go, she wasn't handling it well. Like, I mean, I was in a better position to deal with the crisis that she did, because the immensity of the stories that I was telling her, that the entire towns were cleansed, basically. I wasn't able to talk to my parents on that. And after a few sessions, I just didn't feel like going because it wasn't useful. But on the last session before I stopped going there, she said, what do you do? Like, she asked me, what do you do for, like, to deal with this situation? And I said, like, well, I do a lot of anger writing. Anger writing is just when I have a really frustrating day, when I have heard stories that I shouldn't have, and when I couldn't sleep, I just sit for an hour or two and write about something, like about what the experience of it. And as an academic to sort of like frame it, like what is going on, which is sometimes when I have articles on Tigray as well, like to sort of like frame it and to make sense of it. And she said like, oh, that's actually something we would suggest people do. And I think this has been helpful for me to frame it, to, for example, not feel that this is only happening to you, to us Tigrayans. It's happening to everyone. And to sort of like make sense of what's going on around our life. Whether you are like a, I don't know, bricklayer in Meghalaya, or whether you're a computer scientist or something, you should make sense of your life and you should write it. You should produce, I don't know, art or writing of some form to make sense of it. And that kind of writing could lead to a story that could be published. It's something that could be of use to others as well. And I think that's something we should encourage, and I think people should be encouraged to take that up as a hobby as well.
Well, I think the mental toll that the war had taken on all of us, it's a very relatable experience. I mean, but in terms of the destruction in Tigray, in terms of the environment and all that, I had a similar discussion with Jakob Mulgeta 2 weeks ago. He's a veteran researcher in energy sustainability and all that, and he had similar views to the ones that you are expressing, that the international community, for one reason or another, hasn't really paid attention to that in Tigray. And I asked him what should the incentive structure be for the international community to be responsive to those sorts of tragedies. And I don't quite remember what exactly he said, but he had some views about that. Basically, his point was that there should be some sort of systemic, to use a hackneyed term, change in terms of how the international community works and all that. And I mentioned that because you were also mentioning the summits and conferences and all that people have. But you get the impression that, people have summits for the sake of having summits, but you don't really see practical actions following from those summits. I don't know if there is something that you want to add to that.
I think that's also like I think you asked me this question about why the TPLF sort of like relapsed to the pro-Ethiopia sort of like in the 90s. Why they didn't pursue the agenda, the self-rule agenda that they had in their struggle. And I said like they had this belief that the international community in the international system could recognize the mechanism, the 1995 constitution, the federation as a legitimate mechanism, and that they could intervene whenever there is a crisis, whenever that structure faces a crisis, which was absolute like failure from the TPLF side. Like they didn't know the international community. And I think that was also I study international politics, international development related politics, and I had always like a critical kind of eye because of the topics that I study on the ground, like the fact that you have like really manipulative, exploitative kind of relations between communities, local communities, and international multilateral actors in conservation settings. So I had that sort of like critical view of the international system, but I also had some kind of trust that a crisis of the scale that we saw in Tigray wouldn't happen without any meaningful intervention. And that was a really rude awakening for me, like until 2021, early 2022, I was of the hope that something would happen, like the UN system would intervene, that the EU would put a proper sanction, for example, and that's something the AU would do something. Like of course I had like lost hope of the AU at the beginning, but when you look into these systems carefully and like sort of like at the systemic level again, you see that these were not built for people. And I have had this conversation in different human rights forums. I was in West Africa like earlier this year, where we had this kind of conversation where the UN system isn't built for people, for the people. It's for the member states. And the member states, even though the assumption is that the member states are led by democratically elected representatives of the countries, that's not the case. We know that like 60% of the member states of the UN are undemocratic authoritarian states. And the UN will accept whatever these member states say or do. So if they accept territorial integrity and unity of a country as a legitimate agenda, and not the rights. And you have these attempts, like for example the responsibility to protect and all these like small agreements that have been reached, but they have no bearing in the UN system. So we know that they are not meant for people, and I think that has become absolutely clear for me over the last 4 or 5 years. I think one of the things that we Tigrayans also to a large degree failed, in addition to not writing and communicating, is not communicating with grassroots movements elsewhere. So there are like some efforts here and there, like in major towns and all, but you don't have movements, Ukrainian actors or other like people from marginalized backgrounds, people facing the kind of calamities that we face, and we don't associate ourselves with that kind of movement. And that is my hope, is that those kind of movements are what will lead to some kind of change within the UN and the existing system. I don't think the current system is going to be durable. I don't think it will stay for a long time. There will be a change, and the change will have to incorporate the ideas of people like the grassroots movements that are struggling for survival everywhere. And I think we need to focus on that. We need to invest on that as well.
Absolutely. I think the Mesmer thing is a serious miseducation in Tigray and wholly misleading. For a long time, I had been under the false impression, of course, that Mesmer was a sacred thing, and that if Abiy Ahmed started crossing the Mesmers, the constitution and customs and ways of doing things in Ethiopia, I thought the international community would take notice and intervene, and not just me. Actually, I mean, in a way, it doesn't matter what I believed, but more consequentially, even the TPLF. You could see there were a flurry of letters that they sent to the international community when the writing for the war was on the wall, when they could see that war was coming. They tried. By the way, one of the criticisms that the TPLF, not that I want to defend the TPLF, but one of the criticisms the TPLF gets is that it didn't prepare or it didn't try to stop the war in 2020. But actually, the last 2 or 3 weeks leading up to the war, they tried their best to reach out to anybody who could listen, and they wrote a lot of letters to say that Abiy was coming for the constitution, coming for Tigray, and that the international community had the power to intervene and to stop it. But reading the letters, and we have published them on Tigray, so those of interested could actually go and see. I think they are under the title Tigray letters or something. But reading between the lines, you could sense that the TPLF or the Tigray government believed that the international community wouldn't let Abiy cross Mesmer or the constitution in that context. But of course, one of the wonderful educations that the war has devastating as it has been for our people, the education has been that nobody cares if you are on the right side of geopolitics. You could do anything you want. And you would actually be rewarded for that. And it's in a way, it's very, very depressing that nobody would care for principles and for legality and for norm and for those sorts of things, which we thought were the foundation of how the international community, or the rule-based order, as the sort of pretentious people might say. So, that was...
Yeah, but I think that's also like... there was this telling the interview with a Ukrainian. She's an academic, but she also does like research like this, interviews. And in that long interview, the title is actually, it feels like it's happening only to you. Whenever something like the one we encountered in Tigray happens, it feels like, for Tigrayans, it felt like we were the only people going through that kind of situation. And the reason why it does is because we haven't read enough about what was going on in the world over the last 60 years since the UN was 70 years since the UN was introduced. We haven't read about what was going on at the time, even when the war in Tigray was breaking out. If we did, we could see that the system wasn't working for anyone, for people under the situation that we were going to be through. So, and I think that is something we have to emphasize even now. Like Tigrayans shouldn't expect anything. Like any kind of like intervention from outside to sort our problem. Our problem can only be sorted by our own. So we need to sort of like sit and like look into ways out of this instead of like waiting for a UN system or something else to intervene. And I think that's something that has become clearly apparent for me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the extraordinary examples of this was what happened in Pretoria when the Ethiopian regime and the Tigray delegate were wrangling and haggling for how to come to an agreement. And the Abiy people openly said that they would use siege as a bargaining chip.
Yeah.
That if the Tigray delegates didn't sign on the document that was prepared for them by other people,
Yeah.
that they would sustain the siege, and that they were open about that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, this is really tragic that a government would openly say that it would starve children if armed forces in that locality don't agree to its demand.
It's not tragic anymore.
Yeah.
It's not anymore. I mean, like we see it now, like clearly.
Yeah, I mean, with all the sort of benefits of hindsight, of course,
Starvation.
I have learned now.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not. I don't. Nothing surprises me anymore in terms
Yeah.
of how
So
I see the international community
So
operates.
I think that has been the case. Not as I mean, what happened in Tigray is unprecedented in terms of the scale, but has been going on. Similar practices have been going on, and even the genocide in Rwanda, for example, it was under the full sight of the world. Like people could see what was happening, but they could hear what was being propagated by the Hutu regime in Rwanda. But there was basically no meaningful intervention to stop that. And they knew that they were besieged, they were killing people, they were raping women, but they didn't do anything. And that shouldn't surprise us anymore. I mean, we have seen that on our own families. I'm not surprised anymore. And especially now, the first few years, like the 2 years, it was about trying to get as many people to know, many politicians to know about what was happening. But now I know that even when politicians know, it doesn't mean it will change that much. I think our only hope is to get people to know about it, to get the grassroots to know about these kind of tragedies, and to sort of like mobilize, to be part of a broader mobilization of peoples all over the world towards a change. And I think that's only justice we can expect as Tigrayans as well, to be part of a bigger change in the world that recognize this kind of horrible system that doesn't respond to the needs of people. So I think that's what I would emphasize. We should emphasize on making knowledge about the crisis available to people of similar.
I think we could harp on about this subject all night long. I think if I could shoot the international community to death, I would do that. That is the degree of anger that I have with it. But I promised that I was going to let you go after 1 hour and a half. But my final question, Teklehaymanot, one thing that I sense in terms of my listeners is that they love listening to the sort of the journeys that Tigrayan academics have had, and you are a successful academic, and you have had. I say that because I know you. We have been friends for a long time, since school days. But I think it would be wonderful for our listeners if you could share part of your journey. How does a young Teklehaymanot from a nondescript village in Tigray end up in Manchester?
I don't think it's so different from what you yourself have been through, but well, I have to introduce myself formally. So I'm Teklehaymanot G Weldemichel.
That was something that I should have done at the introduction.
Yes,
I'm not
I
doing my
will
job
introduce
well.
myself.
All right.
So I don't think that many people. I mean, like people that follow Tigray and others, they probably know me, but I don't think that many people know. So, and I was born in Ruwagaret in central Tigray. If anyone knows Ruwagaret, I think it's associated with Mefilelai now, but it's close to between Maikanatal and Adwa, like in the vicinity on that main road. I grew up. My parents are farmers. I grew up in a farm, and I am one of the 7 siblings from my mother and my father. And I have older siblings from my father. So we have several apparently, clearly. So and I went to school in that village from 1 to 5th. And I went to Zongi, the same school as you went, Takhlai, for 2 years, 7th and 8th grade. And I went to high school in Daga Arwi. And after that, I went to Dilla, which is in southern Ethiopia, where I did a bachelor's in curriculum and instruction, which is a study of education policies and stuff. and with a minor in geography, where I finished in 2008. I'm counting in Farangi years now, and I got a position as a graduate assistant at the same place, because in 2008 I was the medal holder of the university for having the highest the mark for the year.
Valedictorian, I think they call it in the US. Yeah, but in
Yeah,
Ethiopia, yeah.
so I stayed there. I worked for 1 year. I taught in the same place where I did my bachelor's. I think it's the same similar story to a lot of my young Ethiopian and Tigrayan academics. And I went to Addis to study a master's degree. I was offered a master's position, and I didn't finish that because I was starving. The salary was quite small, and it was 2 year master's with a 1 year course and then 1 year research time. But then when I was doing that, even though I was doing quite fine academically, I didn't feel like I could do the research time in Addis for second year, and I felt like applying for studies abroad, and I applied for study abroad to Norway, which has a scholarship. So I got a position, master's admission in the University of Science and Technology in Norway, where I joined in 2010, which was a master's of philosophy in development studies, which took 2 years, and I finished and went back to Ethiopia, to Tigray, and I got a position 3.5 years for 3.5 years I worked at the Institute for Environment, Gender and Development Studies in Mekelle, at the University in Mekelle. I used to work in Arid, and then I moved to Norway, back to Norway in 2016 to do a PhD in geography, in human geography, which was what I was talking about, where I had an opportunity to study Kenya and Tanzania, which was like really exciting because it's a different country. Like for a Tigrayan, for a villager who has no experience other than just doing that bachelor degree in Dilla and master's degree in Norway, to get an opportunity to do research somewhere else was like really exciting, and it ended up being really exciting and productive time. And then I handed in my PhD thesis on the 2nd of October 2020, which is exactly 1 month before the war in Tigray broke out. In Norway, when you hand in your doctoral degree, you wait for 5 to 6 months for the committee to go through your thesis and to approve it or disapprove it, or to give you like a revision. And mine was approved for defense without any revision. So in March 2021, I got to defend my PhD dissertation, and I continued where I also, just before around the end of 2020, which is like a few months before the defense, I was offered a postdoctoral position in the same place, which was like a 2-year research position, which I continued for 2 years between April 2020, summer of 2023. And then while at the postdoc, I also applied for a permanent position in the same university. And I was offered an associate professor position to teach human geography at where I graduated from. And that's when I decided to move to Manchester. Like that was like, it was a place that I grew up in. It was a place where academically, this is where I played. Sort of like if there was an equivalent of a flower, this is where I blossomed, where I did all my sort of like conceptual frame, like development of like my academic profile. I loved it, and Norway is like such a place to feel safe, and you have all kind of safety around you, and I think that was So, but then you have this desire also to see something else, to change, and to sort of like feel alive. I think that's what the young people would call it. To feel alive and to check if you fit somewhere else. And I think that was what drove me to sort of like terminating that job and to seek for other positions somewhere else. And I think that's how I ended up in Manchester. And I think Manchester is not a bad place to be.
To vibe, the young people would say. I think
that's a long story being short.
You have done well. You have done well, and you have every reason to be proud of yourself. And maybe on balance, it was the right decision for you to have dropped out of Addis Ababa University. Maybe, I think.
Yes, I think that was probably one of the decisions I have least regret about. So yeah, I mean, in a way, I would like I was saying, it was harder economically, but it's also, I think it opened up
But
for a lot of
was it only sort of economic hardship, or also maybe you were not
oh,
entirely
the
sold
challenge
on
as well.
parts
Like
as well?
I
Yeah.
think you also like I think that the so I told you like in Dilla I had this degree with all I had all quite good grade compared to other students at the time, but then in Addis there wasn't a new, it wasn't thrilling in a sense, like I wasn't getting anywhere in terms of like the challenge that I had to overcome. So the desire to feel challenged, to get something that's new. And of course I also like generally I had this feeling that there are like underlying questions in my life that I wanted to tackle, to address. And I think one of them was like development, like why are we poor, basically. And this has been from like herding cows in Ruagaret to living in Alaga Arwe and to living in Dilla. That has been a constant question of like why are we poor, and this development, political economy kind of studies have always sort of like carried a weight in my thought. And when I saw these positions in Norway, for example, which were like specifically about development studies, like studying why certain societies are poor and why certain societies develop in the way that they do, it has been like really something that I wanted to do. When I got the position, it was like this is, and actually the program kind of ended up being one of those programs that kind of like leads you to tackle some of the underlying challenges in development, like to why we ended up being poor. So like looking into the political economy of poverty, which is also like where the environment and that kind of debate comes to. So yeah, so it wasn't. I mean, it was as an individual, it was economically challenging as well, but it was also the challenge of like the intellectual challenge that I needed, and the kind of access that I needed to that conceptual understanding of development.
Well, I mean, not to be nostalgic or self-indulgent, but isn't life interesting? Who would have thought that 20 or some odd years ago, when we were sitting at those rundown classrooms in Zongi, that 20 years down the line you would be where you are now? I think one of the things that you tend to do as you grow older is you tend to reflect on things in the past, and I find it I find the whole thing fascinating, the journeys, the fact that you have no idea where you would be, 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, and it's amazing life. But yeah, one thing that I feel like I lack in terms of experience in relation to Ethiopia is living outside Tigray, because my whole life in Ethiopia has been confined to Tigray, and in some sense it's positive. I haven't been exposed to any sort of toxicity, but it makes you poor in terms of experience. And I just want to ask you what kind of experience you had at Dilla University. I suppose it would have been sort of new university, right? When you joined, it was one of those universities built by the EPRDF, right?
It was. I think it was part of the same generation as Mekelle, but it was part of the what used to be Dobab University. So it was. I think it was when I started when they split from the Dobab University and became their own university. So I think I always tell my friends here that my first the first assumption that I have of people, of new people, is that people are kind and people are nice. So it takes me a while to filter that out. To if they are not nice, it's up to them. Then I just like sort of like relegate them to that group that they don't want. If they don't want to be with me, or if they want to be friends with me, if they want to be hostile with me, to me. So I think I had that innocence. I think I try to keep that today as well. The innocent look of like people are nice, and then the first that shouldn't be about like relegating people to that and this. So and for someone who grew up in a village in Tigray, we are sort of like my parents and the people that I grew up with never exposed us to the kind of like what do you call it in Amharic, the Renynet. I don't know what it is in English. That kind of like you don't have that kind of exposure. So my parents don't assume because someone is from from I don't know whatever ethnic background is that, and they don't have that kind of stereotypical look at people. So I grew up with that, and when I went to the rest of Ethiopia, like to Dilla, that was like my first go on everyone. But you have those encounters where you have where you face people who have certain assumptions about Tigrayans that would just come out and tell you what they think about it. So the first encounter of that was me and another guy from Tigray. We arrived in Dilla, and Dilla didn't have a whole campus built, so they were like still building. So for the first few nights, they put us in a new campus where there was not that much facility. So we were assigned in a room with four other people from a certain group in a certain region in Ethiopia. And for the first 2 nights, they were really skeptical to hang out with us. They didn't talk to us. We could hear that they were whispering to each other about something whenever we are in the room. And then we would just come in and out of the room. And like after a few days, one of them came and said like, "Are you Tigrayans? Like, are you really Tigrayans?" And he's like, and we asked him like, we were shocked, like, why are you like, we speak Tigrinya and we told you that we were from Tigray. And he said, the Tigrayans that we were trained to, the Tigrayans that we were told to assume is this horrible. So like there was this really horrific kind of assumption, and I think that assumption goes back to the Derg time when the Tigrayans were like sort of like imagined as this horrible people like Chirag. What is Chirag in Amharic? But it's people with horns, sort of kind of like thing. And he was shocked to see that we were like normal people, and that went on, and then like every time you have this. You have to sort of correct someone's assumption to tell them that we are actually real people. We have all kind of people like that. Nice people, all kind of. We are as diverse as anyone else. And then I have those kind of encounters throughout that time where you have to sort of like make that effort to correct the image of the Tigrayans. I don't know if we have succeeded, which is I don't think we have succeeded because we see that we haven't, and that's all the rape and all the violence in Tigrayans is basically based on that assumption that demonized Tigrayans to an extent, to an extent that people want to rape Tigrayans to take the devil out of them. That's
that experience came to me much later in 2011 when I was in Italy. That was the first time where I was exposed to other sort of people in Ethiopia in any proper sense, because there were Ethiopians studying at the university I was studying at in Italy. And it was around the time Meles died. And for some strange reason that I haven't quite understood, after Meles died, a lot of people felt that it was time for them to come to you and to tell you to your face what they had thought all along. And, there were people who truly believed that those of us who were from Tigray were getting some government stipend and we were getting that sort of treatment from the Ethiopian government and all that. And it's shocking, but many, many people truly believed that we were getting stipends and other privileges and all that. And that is actually when I woke up to Ethiopian politics. That's when I started. There's something not quite right. Because until that point, I thought, there are, of course, extremists complaining about one thing or another. There are people who are nostalgic for the previous regime. There are people who have less than positive views about Tigrayans. But I thought they were pretty much in the minority. But that experience in Italy sort of gave me the rude awakening that every one of us has had in their lives at various points in time. Yeah, it's wonderful to hear your experience.
I think the challenge for us was to make that connection from the rhetoric, from the assumptions that they have to the material translation of it, to the connection between what they assume Tigrayans are to the killing, to the burning of alive of Tigrayans. I've never made that connection, and I think that's one of the like really shocking experience for me. Like how whatever is in the minds of people, whatever is their assumption, can easily be translated into a material practice of it. To throw someone into fire, to throw someone alive into fire is basically because you don't assume that person is a person, and that you have that kind of image of them as Chirag, as I told you, and it's been shocking for me to realize that. But it's not a new thing, of course. When you read historical records of other places, this is basically what leads to genocide, what leads to gas chambers and all that kind of stuff.
Well, thank you very much, Teklehaymanot. We're going to leave that at that today. But as we were saying before we started recording, we're going to do another discussion in Tigrinya. And the reason we did this in English was because we thought we'd focus on academic and research matters. And as a policy at Tigat, we hold these sorts of conversations in English. But we're going to sort of zoom in on Tigray another time and reflect on what we think is happening in Tigray. But for today, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tekleh, for having me, and it's been a pleasure.
It was my pleasure indeed.